The economy of South Africa is the second largest in Africa, behind Nigeria. South Africa accounts for 24% of Africa's gross domestic product, and it is ranked as an upper-middle-income economy by the World Bank, one of only 4 such countries in Africa. Since 1996, at the end of over 12 years of international sanctions, South Africa's gross domestic product has almost tripled to $400 billion. And foreign exchange reserves have increased from $3 billion to nearly $50 billion, creating a diversified economy with a growing and sizable African middle class. Within 2 decades of establishing democracy and ending apartheid, high levels of unemployment, income inequality, growing public debt, political mismanagement, low levels of education, reliable access to electricity, and crime are all serious problems that have negatively impacted the South African economy. History. The formal economy of South Africa has its beginnings in the arrival of Dutch settlers in 1652. Originally sent by the Dutch East India Company to establish a provisioning station for passing ships. As the colony increased in size, with the arrival of French Huguenots and German citizens, some of the colonists were set free to pursue commercial farming, leading to the dominance of agriculture in the economy. At the end of the 18th century, the British gained control of the colony. This led to the Great Trek, spreading farming deeper into the mainland, as well as the establishment of the independent Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. In 1870, diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, while in 1886 some of the world's largest gold deposits were discovered in the Witwatersrand region of Transvaal, quickly transforming the economy into a resource-dominated one. The British gained control as a result of the Boer War. The country also entered a period of industrialization during this time, including the organization of the first South African trade unions. The country soon started putting laws distinguishing between different races in place. In 1948, the National Party won the national elections, and immediately started implementing an even stricter race-based policy named apartheid, effectively dividing the economy into a privileged white one, and an impoverished black one. The policy was widely criticized and led to crippling sanctions being placed against the country in the 1980s. South Africa held its first multiracial elections in 1994, leaving the newly elected African National Congress government the daunting task of trying to restore order to an economy harmed by sanctions, while also integrating the previously disadvantaged segment of the population into it. The 1994 government inherited an economy racked by long years of internal conflict and external sanctions. The government refrained from resorting to economic populism. Inflation was brought down, public finances were stabilized, and some foreign capital was attracted. However, growth was still subpar. At the start of 2000, then-President Thabo Mbeki vowed to promote economic growth and foreign investment by relaxing restrictive labor laws, stepping up the pace of privatization, raising governmental spending and cutting interest rates sharply from 1998 levels. His policies faced strong opposition from organized labor. From 2004 onward, economic growth picked up significantly, both employment and capital formation increased. In April 2009, amid fears that South Africa would soon join much of the rest of the world in the late 2000s recession, Reserve Bank Governor Tito Mboweni and Finance Minister Trevor Manuel differed on the matter. Whereas Manuel foresaw a quarter of economic growth, Mboweni predicted further decline. Technically, he said, that's a recession. In 2009, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz warned South Africa that inflation targeting should be a secondary concern amid the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. South Africa, unlike other emerging markets, has struggled through the late 2000s recession. The long-term potential growth rate of South Africa under the current policy environment has been estimated at 3.5%. Per capita GDP growth has proved mediocre, though improving, growing by 1.6% a year from 1994 to 2009, and by 2.2% over the 2000-09 decade, compared to world growth of 3.1% over the same period. The high levels of unemployment, at over 25%, and inequality are considered by the government and most South Africans to be the most salient economic problems facing the country. These issues, and others linked to them such as crime, have in turn hurt investment and growth, consequently having a negative feedback effect on employment. Crime is considered a major or very severe constraint on investment by 30% of enterprises in South Africa, putting crime among the four most frequently mentioned constraints. Historical statistics. This is a chart of the trend of South Africa's gross domestic product at market prices estimated by the International Monetary Fund. Sectors. South Africa has a comparative advantage in the production of agriculture, mining and manufacturing products relating to these sectors. South Africa has shifted from a primary and secondary economy in the mid-20th century to an economy driven primarily by the tertiary sector in the present day, which accounts for an estimated 65% of GDP or $230 billion in nominal GDP terms. The country's economy is reasonably diversified with key economic sectors including mining, agriculture and fisheries, vehicle manufacturing and assembly, food processing, clothing and textiles, telecommunication, energy, financial and business services, real estate, tourism, transportation, and wholesale and retail trade. Natural resources. Mining has been the main driving force behind the history and development of Africa's most advanced and richest economy. Large-scale and profitable mining started with the discovery of a diamond on the banks of the Orange River in 1867 by Erasmus Jacobs and the subsequent discovery and exploitation of the Kimberley Pipes a few years later. Gold rushes to Pilgrim's Rest and Barberton were precursors to the biggest discovery of all, the main reef leader on Gerhardus Oosthausen's farm Langlaagte, Portion C, in 1886. The Witwatersrand Gold Rush and the subsequent rapid development of the gold field there, the biggest of them all. South Africa is one of the world's leading mining and mineral processing countries, though mining's contribution to the national GDP has fallen from 21% in 1970 to 6% in 2011, it still represents almost 60% of exports. The mining sector accounts for up to 9% of value added. In 2008, South Africa's estimated share of world platinum production amounted to 77%, kyanite and other materials, 55%, chromium, 45%, palladium, 39%, vermiculite, 39%, vanadium, 38%, zirconium, 30%, manganese, 21%, rutile, 20%, ilmenite, 19%, gold, 11%, fluorspar, 6%, aluminium, 2%, antimony, 2%, iron ore, 2%, nickel, 2%, and phosphate rock, 1%. South Africa also accounted for nearly 5% of the world's polished diamond production by value. The country's estimated share of world reserves of platinum group metals amounted to 89%, hafnium 46%, zirconium 27%, vanadium 23%, manganese 19%, rutile 18%, fluorspar 18%, gold 13%, phosphate rock 10%, ilmenite 9%, and nickel 5%. It is also the world's third largest coal exporter. The mining sector has a mix of privately owned and state-controlled mines, the latter including African Exploration Mining and Finance Corporation. Agriculture and food processing. The agricultural industry contributes around 10% of formal employment. relatively low compared to other parts of Africa, as well as providing work for casual laborers and contributing around 2.6% of GDP for the nation. However, due to the aridity of the land, only 13.5% can be used for crop production, and only 3% is considered high potential land. The sector continues to face problems, with increased foreign competition and crime being two of the major challenges for the industry. The government has been accused of either putting in too much effort, or not enough effort, to tackle the problem of farm attacks as opposed to other forms of violent crime. Maize production, which contributes to a 36% majority of the gross value of South Africa's field crops, has also experienced negative effects due to climate change. The estimated value of loss, which takes into consideration scenarios with and without the carbon dioxide fertilization effect, ranges between tens and hundreds of millions of rands. According to FAO/STAT, South Africa is one of the world's largest producers of chicory roots, grapefruit, cereals, green maize and maize, castor oil seed, pears, sisal, fiber crops. In the first quarter of 2010, the agricultural sector earned export revenues for R$10.1 billion and used R$8.4 billion to pay for imported agricultural products, therefore earning a positive trade balance of R$1.7 billion. The most important agricultural exports of South Africa include edible fruit and nuts, beverages, preserved food, tobacco, cereals, wool not carded or combed, miscellaneous food, sugar, meat, milling products, malt and starch. These products accounted for over 80% of agricultural export revenue in the first quarter of 2010. The most important agricultural imports, which accounted for over 60% of agricultural import value during the same period, include cereals, meat, soya bean oil, cake, beverages, soya bean oil and its fractions, tobacco, palm oil and its fractions, miscellaneous food, spices, coffee, tea, and preserved food. The dairy industry consists of around 4,300 milk producers providing employment for 60,000 farm workers and contributing to the livelihoods of around 40,000 others. The food subsector is the largest employer within the agro-processing sector, contributing 1.4% to total employment, and 11.5% within the manufacturing sector. In 2006, the agro-processing sector represented 24.7% of the total manufacturing output. Although the economy as a whole gained 975,941 jobs between 1995 and 2006, the agro-processing sector lost 45,977 jobs. The competitive pressures from abroad, particularly from China and India, played a role in the decline of exports for the food, textiles and paper subsectors, as firms in these sectors increasingly compete with lower-cost producers. Increased exports from the beverages, tobacco, wood and leather subsectors over the period are probably due to the presence of large dominant firms within these sectors in South Africa that have managed to remain competitive. Manufacturing. The manufacturing industry's contribution to the economy is relatively small, providing just 13.3% of jobs and 15% of GDP. Labor costs are low, but not nearly as low as in most other emerging markets, and the cost of the transport, communications and general living is much higher. The South African automotive industry accounts for about 10% of South Africa's manufacturing exports, contributes 7.5% to the country's GDP and employs around 36,000 people. Annual production in 2007 was 535,000 vehicles, out of a global production of 73 million units in the same year. Vehicle exports were in the region of 170,000 units in 2007, exported mainly to Japan, Australia, the UK and the US. South Africa also exported 30.3 billion South African rands worth of auto components in 2006. BMW, Ford, Volkswagen, Daimler Chrysler, General Motors and Toyota all have production plants in South Africa. Large component manufacturers with bases in the country are Arvin Exhaust, Bloxwich, Corning and Senior Flexonics. There are also about 200 automotive component manufacturers in South Africa, and more than 150 others that supply the industry on a non-exclusive basis. The industry is concentrated in two provinces, the Eastern Cape and Gauteng. Companies producing in South Africa can take advantage of the low production costs and the access to new markets as a result of trade agreements with the European Union and the Southern African Development Community. After a steep decline of 10.4% in 2009, the manufacturing sector performed well in 2010, growing by 5%. Though this rebound was limited to the automotive, basic chemicals, iron and steel and food and beverages industries. The performance of this sector remains curtailed by the low demand in South Africa's main export markets in the developed world. Service industry. The domestic telecommunications infrastructure provides modern and efficient service to urban areas, including cellular and internet services. In 1997, Telkom, the South African telecommunications parastatal, was partly privatized and entered into a strategic equity partnership with a consortium of two companies, including SBC, a U.S. telecommunications company, in exchange for exclusivity to provide certain services for 5 years. Telkom assumed an obligation to facilitate network modernization and expansion into the unserved areas. A second network operator was to be licensed to compete with Telkom across its spectrum of services in 2002, although this license was only officially handed over in late 2005 and has recently begun operating under the name of Neotel. 5 mobile phone companies provide service to over 20 million subscribers, with South Africa considered to have the fourth most advanced mobile telecommunications network worldwide. The 5 major cellular providers are Vodacom, Mountain, Cell C, 8Tar and Virgin Mobile. Business process outsourcing. Over the last few decades, South Africa and particularly the Cape Town region has established itself as a successful call center and business process outsourcing destination, with a highly talented pool of productive labor and with Cape Town sharing cultural affinity with Britain. Large overseas firms such as Lufthansa, Amazon.com, Asda, the Carphone Warehouse, Delta Airlines and many more have established inbound call centers within Cape Town as a means of utilizing Cape Town's low labor costs and talented labor force. Tourism. South Africa is a popular tourist destination, with around 860,000 arrivals per month, of which around 210,000 is from outside the African continent. In 2012, South Africa received 9.2 million international arrivals, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. Travel and tourism directly contributed 102 billion South African rands to South African GDP in 2012 and supports 10.3% of jobs in the country. Among the main attractions are the diverse and picturesque culture, the game reserves and the highly regarded local wines. Financial services. South Africa has a sophisticated financial structure with the JSE Securities Exchange, a large and active stock exchange that ranks 18th in the world in terms of total market capitalization as of March 2009. The banking industry, overseen by the South African Reserve Bank, is dominated by 4 local players: Nedbank, Absa, Standard Bank, and FirstRand. These banks provide both retail and investment banking services as the sector has become highly competitive with the re-entry of many experienced foreign banks, which returned to the market in the mid-1990s, having left in the late 1980s. Banks operating in South Africa, when left short of liquidity, need to borrow from the SARB at a fluctuating repo rate, which in turn allows the central bank to monitor liquidity positions, trade and investment principal international trading partners of South Africa, besides other African countries, include Germany, the United States, China, Japan, the United Kingdom and Spain. Chief exports include corn, diamonds, fruits, gold, metals and minerals, sugar, and wool. Machinery and transportation equipment make up more than one-third of the value of the country's imports. Other imports include chemicals, manufactured goods, and petroleum. As a result of a November 1993 bilateral agreement, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation can assist U.S. investors in the South African market with services such as political risk insurance and loans and loan guarantees. In July 1996, the U.S. and South Africa signed an investment fund protocol for a $120 million OPIC fund to make equity investments in South and Southern Africa. OPIC is establishing an additional fund, the Sub-Saharan Africa Infrastructure Fund, capitalized at $350 million, to investment in infrastructure projects. The Trade and Development Agency also has been actively involved in funding feasibility studies and identifying investment opportunities in South Africa for U.S. businesses. Despite the numerous positive economic achievements since 1994, South Africa has struggled to attract significant foreign direct investment. The situation may have started to change, however, with 2005 seeing the largest single FDI into South Africa when Barclays bought a majority share in local bank Absa Group Limited. Deals between the British-based Vodafone and South Africa's Vodacom have taken place in 2006. In 2010, two multi-billion-dollar deals, one by HSBC to acquire Nedbank and one by Walmart to acquire Massmart Holdings, fell through. Land reform and property rights. Nationalization of mines debate. South Africa has been riven by arguments over whether the state should take over mineral resources. A study commissioned by the African National Congress recommended against the policy, saying nationalization would be an economic disaster. Land redistribution. The government aims to transfer 30% of the 82 million hectares presumed to be in the hands of white farmers by Gujal N.K. Winter, Minister of Rural Development and Land Reform, amounting to 24.5 million hectares, to black farmers by 2014. 6.7 million hectares had been transferred by early 2012 via redistribution and restitution. The land reform program has been criticized both by farmers' groups and by landless workers, the latter alleging that the pace of change has not been fast enough, and the former alleging racist treatment and expressing concerns that a similar situation to Zimbabwe's land reform policy may develop. A fear exacerbated by comments made by former Deputy President Phumzile Malamba N.G. Kuka.